we are in Cadre Bay on the traditional lands of the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations. And we've been living here for, since the 1990s. So I'm very happy and honored to be able to live on these traditional lands. Backstory is really important to understand context of whatever news story that you're talking about. So things are happening now. Why did they happen? What was in the past that brought people to the decisions that they made in the past that affects people now? And so when I start writing, and I'm an amateur historian, so I'm not trained in history, but I'm very much interested in history. And when I research a book or research a story, particularly, well, it's mostly history, I really like to dig in. So I do a lot of reading. So for example, when I was writing A Cowherd in Paradise, which is a story about my family and how they were affected by the laws that BC and Canada had that were against the Chinese. So immigration laws, head tax laws, those kinds of things. And I wanted to understand why Canada acted that way, why the government of Canada acted that way. But I also wanted to understand the history of where my parents came from. So I read about Chinese history, which is very long, but the history that took part while just before they were born and during the time that they were alive. My parents' story spans 100 years. My dad was born in 1902. My mother died in 2002. But I needed to understand what was happening in the world, whether it was in China or Canada or BC, that created the situation where governments felt that they needed to limit Chinese immigration. And because of that, what were the decisions that my father made to come to a place that didn't want him? And how did he, how was he able to afford paying the $500 head tax? How did he live? Why did he come here and go to Montreal? Why did he go back to China to get married? So it's understanding the backstory, which provides motives, understanding the thought processes hopefully the thought processes of why people made the decisions that they did. Stories about individuals, I mean, when I'm reading a story about individuals, it's much more compelling than stories about a swath of people, like a whole population of people were impacted by a tsunami or a war or whatever. I find that much more difficult to feel personally aligned to, or a personal understanding, and it touches me more when I read about a story about an individual or a family or a community. I mean, that's what novels are about, right? And that's why we all love to read about those things. And so when I'm writing about history, I try to make it so that the reader feels that they get to know this person from history, a real life person who actually lived and contributed to our community that we have today. So some of the stories, well, I'll tell you about one group that I thought was really interesting, who came to Victoria. A group that I never would have expected would have come and stayed here, and that's the Hawaiians. So the Hudson's Bay Company had a recruiting agency in Hawaii. The Hawaiians at the time, again, some more backstory, the Hawaiians at the time were feeling, the individuals were feeling a little bit that they were being oppressed by royalty and by rules and very strict rules that was happening in Hawaii. And so they wanted to have an adventure. They wanted to see what life was like outside of Hawaii. And so they were quite willing to work for the Hudson's Bay. They were very good sailors, they were good navigators, and they were strong, and they were very good, dependable workers. And so Hudson's Bay had this recruiting agency that was in operation for over 30 years. And so they brought people over, had them working in all parts of the Pacific Northwest, They worked as trappers, hunters. They worked as farmers, as laborers. There are still Hawaiian names, place names, all up and down the coast here, and down in Washington State. And so you might see Kanaka Place or Kanaka Row, and the place that they lived in Fort Vancouver, when the Hudson's Bay Company had its headquarters in Fort Vancouver, which is now in Washington State. The Hawaiians as a group was the largest non-Indigenous, non-white ethnic group that lived on the Pacific Northwest, and that they made up over 50% of the total roster of workers there. And when they completed their contracts, some of them went back home to Hawaii, but others decided that they wanted to stay. And so many of them went to Salt Spring Island, some of the smaller islands around here, and they farmed because they were able to preempt land. And they might have gone back to the subsistence living that they had done like they were in Hawaii. And there's still a group of Hawaiians, at least one family of Hawaiians who live on Salt Spring Island, who can trace their ancestry back to Hawaii, and they've been back and forth, and they have luau's, or up until the 80s, had luau's every year, and would go back to Hawaii every once in a while to reconnect with their family there. So I found that quite fascinating. People coming from what we think of as paradise to come and live here in what they would have found as very cold and a harsh environment. So when James Douglas came to Victoria to build Fort Victoria, the Hawaiians helped build it, and they actually lived outside the fort. And the place where they lived was called Kanaka Row. Emily Carr actually wrote about Kanaka Row in her Book of Small, and it's now known as Humboldt Street, right outside of where the Empress Hotel stands. So we had our own Kanaka Row. When I first came to live here in Victoria, I came from Montreal, which was linguistically and ethnically diverse. And when I came here in the 1980s, Victoria was still more British than the British. It was known for its high tea and for its rose gardens, and more than for any of the ethnic restaurants that you see now. There weren't even many good coffee places when I first came. So it was very interesting for me when I went into the archives to look for stories about what it was like in Victoria. I found a quotation about actually how diverse it was, and also about how friendly everybody was amongst each other, amongst those diverse groups. Now, this was written by a minister, so he might have had, some quite benevolent views and he probably met, the really nice people. But I was very, very much impressed with how diverse it was, and so that's how I started digging into all these stories. And the very first story that I saw in the BC archives was a story about this family, this Hawaiian family who lived on Salt Spring Island, and who found out that they had relatives in Hawaii. The Kachedas were the father and son. Mr. Kacheda came from Japan to actually create the very first traditional Japanese gardens. And then the Takeda family partnered with the son to operate the very first Japanese tea gardens and tea room. That was in Esquimalt. It lasted for over 30 years. The family lived there and operated this beautiful gardens. The kids were born here, went to school, went to all the local schools and the high school, but they couldn't go with their friends to Crystal Gardens to swim, because Asians weren't allowed to swim in Crystal Gardens. And then during the Second World War, the family was separated. So mom and the daughters were separated from dad and the sons. They were sent to different internment camps in some wilderness community in British Columbia. And after the Second World War, they never returned to British Columbia to live. Meanwhile, Their property was vandalized. The beautiful gardens was totally destroyed to show what it was like for a Canadian Japanese family, you know, who had grown up here and who had provided so much beauty and entertainment for the locals, and then to have their home destroyed because of the, you know, because of what was happening in the war. And hopefully that is, people can resonate with that story more than all, you know, the history of the thousands of Japanese who were interned, and you know, it's a one-on-one story.